you for your comments. I know the floor is yours. And I would like to ask those who ask questions to tell their names and institutions they represent. Yes, thank you. First.
My name is Hans-Christian Jasch. I'm the managing director of the House of the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, where in 1942 the ministerial bureaucracy of the Nazi state met in order to discuss the logistics of the planned murder of 11 million people. My question is, how do we deal with these overlaps in memory? We spoke about perpetrators. I found this a very interesting approach, especially since I'm coming from a memorial which deals primarily with perpetrators. But how do we deal with the fact, which you find in most Central Eastern European countries, including Germany, that some of the victims of the establishment of Soviet rule in Central Eastern Europe were actually guilty, not only in Germany but also in other occupied countries, of having been, for different motives, part of the collaboration in the genocide against Jews or other groups. I mean, the case of Ukraine is particularly complicated, where you had retaliation between Poles and Ukrainians. You had a sort of civil war-like situation, ethnic cleansing situation. You had resistance against different forms of occupation. And how do we deal with the dilemma that the murder of the Jews was in most parts the murder of an enemy which was a fictive enemy, whereas when we deal with the suppression of armed resistance, there is also a different degree of victimhood, where we are not looking at victims which are completely innocent, but we look at people who are engaging in combat. How do we keep this apart? This would be something I would be interested in.
Thank you. Who would like to reply?
Oh,
yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I think that this reinforces what I was saying in my talk. I mean, the important role that historians have to play, I think, is by simply making these differences clear, making clear the responsibilities that people have for, for perpetrating crimes, even if they later on become, in inverted commas, victims. I think there's no way in which we can merge them all together. I think the important thing is to encourage people to have quite sophisticated and complex memories about these issues, that they don't automatically ascribe victimhood or perpetration one way or the other. I think that makes, I mean, it seems to me the problem, and it's a problem I think that this network confronts, is that these are extremely complex questions, whereas memory can often be very simplified, and indeed it's a process of simplification. And trying to get a balance between what historians write and what people remember is, I think, a very difficult question.
Yeah, yes, please.
I just stress this is, of course, that collaborators and murders should be punished, but also murders, such as genocide and the people, the bystanders, but also perpetrators, and especially they have also rights for just system, yeah, decent processes. And the problem with communism was first, there was not decent processes, the first. The second, that they actually not was trying to punish the collaborators or perpetrators, especially in Polish case, but actually the heroes of resistance. I don't, for instance, Władysław Bartoszewski died, yeah, 2 weeks ago, as far as I remember. Yeah, was put into jail. Yeah, he was a member of Żegota. Pilecki was killed, you know, and so on. So it's I think that the Poland and probably the Czech Republic was a bit at a different situation that Hungary, Romania, and so on in each respect, because we were a part of the alliance struggling against Hitler from the beginning to the end of the war. And even Polish right-wing organization, which can be criticized, were part of the resistance, what is also the difference to many European countries. This is one remark. The second is, you know, yeah, of course I understand this, this important differentiation between memory and history, but you also mentioned that it would be a mistake to say that historians, that professional historians, are above history and above politics. Because, you know, I am, after many years in academia, I spent at many universities my whole life, I would say, yeah, scientists, intellectuals are not change their opinion, mostly because of the pressure of the public, of the suppressed memory, because of the politician. Sometimes, you know, it was the politics which showed the new direction. The best example would be, for instance, this book, Black Book of Communists, which was also highly political book. So even if we should preserve the scientific standards and so on, we should be conscious also as scholars that we are, I say this as a sociologist, we are part of the society, our attitudes are changing. There's no possible, I am Weberian scholar, but I don't think it is possible value-free narration. We are conformist because we depend on Forschungsgeld, on research money. There's a kind of idolatry, especially in general, so-called Forschungsstand. But sometimes when we develop our research, we forget very important things. And I am not really, when you said this about victims, I said it's a really important point, but I would say we should actually not only concentrate of this opposition, perpetrators and victims. We probably should find different categories. We forgot, for instance, also heroic resistance, military virtue. They are important things, you know. I know that it is, to be honest, I think it is very special for Germany, this concentration, one on the victims and on the other hand on perpetrators, and not really of the, you know, fight of the right side in a right moment. It's very important in life, yeah, also for historians.
Thank you. And Professor Noff, you also.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question and the additional informations you've mentioned. My initial response was just one sentence saying, yes, exactly, that's what we need, I would say. Independent on about which kind of crime context or national context we speak, I would still say that's even necessary and important for Germany. And I think that's the context I know best from all which are to be discussed here. And I think that for Germany, what I referred to, this cult of victimhood, the cult of victimhood since the 1960s, also served quite well to cover or to hide many important aspects which are important, or that are important for the relation between those group of people, the minor group of people that had been defined as perpetrators, and the rest of the society. And I would say now, only 30 years after that kind of memory, a victim-oriented memory had been established in Germany, by now Thanks, I would say, also to impulses which came not from Germany, but Christopher Browning's study, for example, bringing into our mind the idea of ordinary Germans, although one has to discuss that at length, nevertheless, it brought back an issue which led exactly to what you've then said. Both categories, victims and perpetrators, are themselves products of memorial cultures. So I've used them just to make a very clear position here, but it includes in itself that we should also try to find different terms for it in order to not to kind of always fall back into the minorization of perpetrators by using the term. All issues you've mentioned, like collaboration, profiteering, whatsoever, is important to make us understand that crimes do not happen by minorities of people, but are always a product of societies. And this is, I think, at the heart of our understanding of the history of Europe, which means a memory is not a memory that leaves the history of the perpetratorship out.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Aline Zerb, Maastricht University. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this very provocative panel, I think. I suspect there's a lot of different opinions in the room now on what we've heard. I have a specific question to Harburg Knoch. I wonder if you don't contradict yourself a little bit by saying we have to start from values. We have to first have the values and then we select the memories. I'm not sure if maybe I'm simplifying a little bit what you've just said. But if we do that, don't we risk that we then do some kind of a selection of memories? What happens, for example, with perpetrator memories? If we have the values first and then we select, don't we just exclude some, for example? And that goes together with another point I'd like to make. I think the values are the only thing that links us. We have different narratives, we have different memories, we have different histories, but I think what we come back to, and this is the only European thing we have, are the values, democratic values.
Well, fortunately, I haven't used the term select when I try to dislink value and memory or turn it around. But you're right that it brings us into some difficult situation, because our understanding is, as I said, that we do this memory and remembrance because we think that we can derive, or we derive, certain values, national, European, global values from it, or that we have done that already, and that we can teach that. This is the approach I argued against. You're right that when it comes to turn it around, we have to be careful that it does not become a selection procedure. And this is why I, not really consciously, but would say, did not use the term select. But you are right in saying that this relation is not really clear. So if we turn it around, what does it mean? Is there any institution that defines our values? And then we look, does memory fit to it? And I would say no, that cannot be the case. I think it's rather that we have to be aware that memory should not instrumentalize, that is the basic idea in that, should not instrumentalize people as victims in order to derive values for any other purpose. Like I would argue that if we share any values, we can develop them without victim-oriented memory, and we should do so. But if we have an understanding of that, and if we do not instrumentalize victims for this purpose, then we can really come to an understanding of memory which is not, in any case, defined by external purposes. So what I'm arguing for is we always have to be aware of a kind of memory which is memory for the sake of the people who suffered. This is, for me, the core of memory. The moment when we imply into this partly very individual act And there we have really a chance for empathy. But the moment when we imply into this very individual act all the kind of obligations that we know from our memorial work, then I would say we have a problem, because we try to use memory for the establishment of values and the delineation of values from memory. And we instrumentalize the victims for it. And that makes it, and this is the kind of connects it to the perpetrator issue. Once we do that, we also are in a very broad field of victimization of and victimhood. That is true, that the suffering of people is to a large extent very equal. The suffering itself is very similar and equal. But this is not, I would say, the starting point for understanding the differences and implications of our European history in terms of why it came to the suffering and what were the reasons of the suffering.
Sorry, Thomas, can I add something
yes.
to that? I just want to add something, because in fact I shared your concerns slightly, I think, with your comments about values coming first, because that seems to me to be precisely what this organization is devoted to, is to recognizing the fact that people have very different value systems. I'll take the example of Italy, which I didn't talk about at length, but it's interesting that we don't talk about it when we're talking about these things. But in Italy, for example, where neo-fascism has been able to remain a mainstream element in Italian politics and so on, they even have members in parliament, etc., etc. In Italy, different memories of the war are just as divided as they were 50 years ago, and that's because people have entirely different value systems. You have people whose value systems are neo-fascist. You have people whose value systems are still old-fashioned Stalinist. It's an extraordinary range. But their approach to memory of the war is determined by their particular moral outlook.
Aaron, I think you also wanted to...
Well, there was something which I couldn't get the point. You thought that we cannot use memories for creating values. If I understood correctly.
We can.
Yeah, of course we are able to, but we should not, you thought. Okay, then what about the military virtues of resistors and so on, which has been mentioned as well?
I'm saying the moment when we start to do that, and we do that unconsciously, so to say, like, or unreflective, when we start to derive values from our historic interpretations, we are not open and objective enough, so to say, to understand what happened in history. Because we use history for a specific purpose. And this is what I try to disconnect. We have to disconnect it, and we need, of course, an understanding on which basis, for example, we do that kind of historiographical research. Definitely. This is value-oriented discourse. I fully agree. But we should, I mean, it's also some kind of circulus viciosus. If we kind of try to use our victim-oriented approach to derive values, and we educate them, and from that we argue these are our values. And this is the link I see what makes it difficult, because then the instrumentalization becomes always subject to the, let's say, danger or reality of political and other interests. That is where I see whenever you have that close link of defining a group of people as victims and deriving values from that, it's always subject to the implications of political and other interests. And that means you, in a way, put victims in a position, or people who you declare as victims or describe as victims, into a position that they cannot defend themselves against being used for other purposes. And this is why I have my problems with this link. I'm not saying that we cannot learn from those people, or that we cannot have them as orientation marks in our life. This is, I would agree. I mean, that's also my personal experience.
Thank you.
But I would say, just remember this very neo-Kantian position, you know, that there's a researcher, his values, the value can be, yeah, and then there are history and narratives, and I think it's not realistic. You say it's a circle, but it is hermeneutic circle. That means history is full of values, the people remember, we are part of this stream of history. What we, if we will or not, we reflect this, we systematize it. Here we try to put this not in memoirs but in the scientific books. But these books are also a part, reflect something, this meta-narration of the narration of the people, and it is totally always with values and so on. So I think it's really yeah, it's really not very realistic your position to make the differentiation.
But there are some questions, so we will get new impetus, I think, from the floor. Yes, please.
I'm Isabella Oswald, I'm a historian, and I recently worked with a project involving a tyrosine diary. And my question or additional comment to this discussion is, there's an American psychologist, Marshall Rosenberg, who created a method called nonviolent communication. And his approach was not using values, as you call it, but human needs, and maybe it's just a proposal for another term, because human needs like surviving or food or whatever can be applied to both sides, and it's without differentiating between perpetrators and victims. And I know that he also did some projects in prisons and also like in the context of Israel and Palestine, and maybe we can talk afterwards.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Yes, please.
Gerhard Weak, Life Aid International. Only one short question. How help experience from 20th century for future, for today, for us, European? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I missed the beginning of the question. How helpful is it?
Yeah.
Short question, long answer.
Well, start.
Well, this is a question that was asked, I think, at an earlier session too, really, about what do we do. I mean, I think in this case it is, of course, extraordinarily helpful, because we're talking about experiences in the 20th century which are indeed unique and colossal. We're talking about genocide, we're talking about the biggest wars in human history. We're talking about things which still challenge even historical understanding. For the 21st century, these are examples that we need to always bear in mind. We need always to be thinking and testing what it is that current politics and politicians want to do. We need to always be testing what are the big movements going on and what impact might they have on the 21st century. I'm often asked by journalists, the last question is usually, do you think there will be a third world war, Professor Overy? And I never say yes. I think sometimes I will say yes. But I say, you know, this isn't really what historians do, but what historians do is to highlight those aspects of the 20th century where we require constant vigilance. And I think one of the things historians do, as well as people who run museums, all the other institutions that we've talked about in the last couple of days, that what they do is to keep that level of awareness, vigilance I would call it, civic vigilance. It's something which we all need to be aware of, and historians have a very important part to play.
Thank you for underlining the values and the values of historians. And that, and
yeah, I agree, but maybe one aspect more. I think it's it would be not really, when we are talking about totalitarianism, it would be probably a mistake, and there's sometimes a mistake, you know, to make so very simple dualism. And there's sometimes in the public, you know, we have On the other hand, we had a bad totalitarianism, yeah, that's totalitarian regimes, Soviet communism, and Nazi or fascist too, regimes, and now we are living in democracy. This is why it is actually used also in the public discourses. Because when I sometimes look back at the past and thinking what young people really understand how communism worked, yeah. I remember I came here to Vienna 85, 86, where communism was still alive, and so probably they don't understand because and this is why we need actually this subtle and interesting, complicated historical studies. But we also should not be so sure about so-called our democratic values, that there are such, you know, I meet sometimes neo-Stalinists. They don't know that they are neo-Stalinists. There are some also prominent intellectuals like Sławoj Žižek who declared himself as a neo-Stalinist. He's very popular among American students and so on. Probably we have also find some people who incline to a kind of ideology of National Socialism without sometimes not knowing this. So and back to the values, because, you know, we all could agree, you know, such a values, freedom, yeah, free speech, and so on, so on. The difference between also many political movements in Europe consists in it when we ask, but what does it mean precisely? And then we have these big values interpreted in contexts, historical contexts. So maybe then we can understand that freedom, for instance, but means something a little different for Germans and Poles and maybe British people and Hungarian and so on. And the same, and sometimes all the words are misused. For me, it is interesting in the European Parliament to see how, in many cases, far right and far left are the same opinion, using also similar vocabulary, yeah, talking about, depending, for instance, Russian policy, or yeah, and so. And I would say, totalitarian tendencies in our age are visible, yeah. For me, the last sentence, for me, the core of totalitarian movement, it was revolutionary movement to change the world, to change human condition, to create a new human being. And this inclination is still in our technology age, still existing. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, can I just...
Yeah,
partly because I'm convinced about that, but partly for the sake of our discussion, I want to say there's no such thing as experience. We may believe that, but it isn't. Perhaps on a very, very individual level where we have no access to it, but as historian John Scott has already said 30 years ago, in historical perspective, there's no experience we as historians have access to. The only thing we have are individual, biographical, social, political, media, public constructions of experience. And this is why I'm stressing that we should be so careful with all these umbrella terms, because they include patterns of constructions of experience. And it becomes, for me personally and particularly, also difficult when I have to notice that even people who suffered and survived become part of a system of, let's say, the patternization of experience. And this is why I think we need a critical research of this whole processes whenever the authenticity of experience, for example, is mentioned or is part of our historiographical, political, educational purposes. We have to see that everything of it is a product of cultural patterns. And this is important because it allows us, and that brings me to the question before I had to think about it. That brings me to the human needs issue, because what I'm looking for is we have to my mind, we have to contextualize, at least from a historical point of view, all what we are discussing about into a bit longer history of the development of human personhood or of subjectivity, because that is what, in a sense, links all of us together in Europe, but kind of extending that a bit, links us together the question of how, in particular since the late 18th, but let's say the 19th century, elements of individuality and personhood and subjectivity have been developed on all levels of our particularly academic endeavors to understand what human beings are doing, and to set and discuss also frames of what they are allowed to do. And this is in a way the relation to the needs issue, and opens up a more a broader picture of how we can get out of this dichotomy of victimhood and perpetratorship.
Thank you. There is another question. There are two questions. Isn't this?
Susanna Tuban, Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. I actually have a lot of sympathy with Professor Koch's perspective on the needs of antagonism. First of all, non-empathic memory, and I would also add not identificatory memory, which would also help us to overcome some problems with another umbrella term that's returned very often, especially in this debate, the we. The we and the perspective which, for instance, in Professor Krasnodębski's speech was referred to as the Polish perspectives, from which and in the name of which he was speaking. And I think that we are dealing constantly with the problem of the persistence of methodological nationalism, with which we are trying to fight also through a conference like that. But actually it turns out that this is a closed circuit between national and transnational, meaning European perspective. So I would be interested, and my question is to Professor Krasnodębski, if he could differentiate a little bit the Polish perspective. So for instance, a sentence like the fact that Poles didn't go with the Russians with the Germans to Moscow in 1941 ended with slavery that lasted until 1989 is probably, from some perspectives, a little bit problematic. So I would be interested in another perspective than the one that he proposed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, of course, there's not homogenic national community, but there are differentiation, the differences, there are discussion, hot debates. I mentioned this also between Poles. I think that probably still national culture are very important, because you know, even you mentioned trans-European attitude. Yeah, mostly, of course, in the sense we are all trans-European. We meet in Vienna, we talk in English or German, and we exchange our experiences. But still, after living many years abroad, I know how influential is national culture, language, experiences, what is sedimented in culture. And of course, this is different. We know that Germans are different yeah. But still, it's this few Poles, as a Polish experience. I think one of constitutive event is that we 39 have chosen this way, not the other. And there was a Hitler-Stalin pact, and there was occupation, but yeah, so you cannot deny it, whereas Hungarian history was a bit different in this, with Trianon and so on. And we cannot avoid, yeah. And for me to say about Europe, for me it is actually what is so interesting in Europe, these differences, and not, mishmash and uniforms, in which everybody. So you probably don't share my opinion about. We have now in Poland very left-wing also students who will probably defend real socialism. Yeah. There are generation differences and so on, but as I said, still national perspective, also as a member state in the European Union, still a very important part of our culture. So this is probably my answer, and I would say this very. Because I share many also critical points about this, I think in this umbrella concept, this is probably something which is danger in this so-called trans-European, transnational discourse, that we use this very general concept, and then actually this concept sometimes lacking of meaning, or they are probably interpreted, or they are connected with values which are found self-evident, because values should be also discussed with the context and so. So I think it's a danger, and talking about totalitarian tendencies, I would say the danger is, in our age, the danger is to divide very easy the people today in Europe among those who are remaining in their national culture and those who are already freischwebende Intelligenz, to use the Karl Mannheim term. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Mein Name ist Alex, ich bin eigentlich nur Geschichts- und Politik interessierter Mensch. Meine Frage richtet sich an Herrn Knoch. Wodurch unterscheidet sich die heutige Gesellschaft vor jener vor 70, 80 Jahren, wo wir gleichsam vor dem Weltkrieg gegen den Terror, CIA-Entführungen, CIA-Folterungen, Guantanamo etc. Augen und Ohren verschließen? Also was hat sich geändert in der Gesellschaft selber? Also Erinnern und Gedenken alleine sind meiner Meinung nach viel zu wenig. Und, ja.
I'm wondering why you addressed that question particularly to me and not to the rest of the panel. I agree with the second part of your question. I would say that memory is not sufficient to bring us from state A to state B. That's why I made that kind of distinction. So we need some kind of academic, institutional, NGO-based whatsoever means to also to control what happens in the field of memory, so to say that. But the other question is, the other part of your question is more a matter of historical interpretation, and is it really the same to which you in a way referred? The situation of 70 to 80 years ago, and you made that kind of link between the situation of the war and that we close our eyes with regard to CIA affairs and so on. I'm not sure whether this is really on the same level. So is it really a matter when it comes to the Second World War we are talking about, that it happened and occurred? Was that really a matter of not noticing it or closing our eyes in front of it? I wouldn't say so. I think that the Second World War has much more to do with some kind of politicized collective agency. And if you would ask me what is the major difference, just referring to the Western world, whatever that is, Heinrich August Winkler has written 4,000 pages on it, so you can read that if you want and if your German is good enough to stand that. But whatever that is, use that umbrella term for the moment, the kind of Western world, there I would say is the basic shift that we don't follow that kind of political collective agency which brings people and nations in that sense in their full into war against each other under the head of ideologies, because there's some kind of resistance based on values wherever they may come from, which allows us and brings us to the situation to ask the question, why is it the fact that we close our eyes in front of what happens with the CIA and so on? And this is, to my mind, in your question, also the answer. Although I would say I'm not happy with what's going on in our world today, and this is why I totally agree, memory, although politicians very often use that for that purpose, memory is not our solution to these problems. That is only, if there is any solution of it, maybe a better understanding of human agency.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, my name is Burkhard Raschowski. I'm from the Federal Institution for History of Eastern Europe in Oldenburg, but also I'm connected with the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity. There is, well, the German history of the Second World War is a very particular one, and also the kind how both German states, but in particular Western Germany was dealing with the past, was also a very particular one. We used the term of negative memory, so that the Germans, in particular the West Germans, are very proud that they were coming to terms with the National Socialist past because of the simple fact that they were mainly the perpetrators. To my observation, in the last 15 years, one can observe then the tendency in West European countries, but in particular in Central and East European countries, that the research is much more focusing on bystanding or people who were willingly or unwillingly beneficiaries of the Holocaust, for example, by taking over Jewish property or things like that. Would you agree with these observations? And is this might bring some positive results for broader understanding or even to bridge certain asymmetries on the common European history? That would be my question to you.
Yes, please.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. And of course, we're talking about a different thing here, about how, not just public memory, but how historiography has changed over the last 20 years. Because I think a lot of the driving force in compelling publics in Italy or in France, for example, to confront things that they did during the Second World War, has come from historians who've exposed things that had otherwise been deliberately suppressed. And what strikes me as interesting, since we're talking about memory, is that for a very long period of time, much of Europe had a selective amnesia about things it didn't want to think about. And they were encouraged in that, of course, by seeing Germans as the sole perpetrators of both the war and, of course, later on the genocide. And I think that this is, I mean, from my point of view, it's almost certainly beneficial, because what it means is that, you know, the patterns of myth which are being constructed in many European countries about the nature of the war and their participation in it are gradually being undermined and altered, and the public is becoming more aware. And the more aware it becomes, the easier it is, I think, to acknowledge that history and to move on. Now, Germans, of course, have been doing that for a very long period of time. I think it will be some time before the rest of Europe, in a sense, has caught up with that process. But it does seem to me that one of the things we should be doing here is acknowledging what myths still exist and trying to find ways of undermining those and creating a collective consciousness about what Europe went through during this period, which is not entirely governed by the construction of false memories. So yes, I think it is a European phenomenon now, not just a German phenomenon.
Yes, please.
My name is Attila Pók. I work for the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and have been for 6 years the Hungarian coordinator in the European Network of Remembrance and Solidarity. And I should like to ask you for some advice concerning our strategy. I mean the strategy of our network. Because we had some internal discussions about the second element of our name, solidarity. Because so far we basically talked about remembrance, but what about solidarity? For example, whenever there is some kind of a topical international political issue where we should take sides on behalf of whoever the victim at the moment is, should we speak up or leave the discussions to an academic environment? Shall we become political on the basis of our whatever experiences? Shall we share our thoughts with the public, or rather prefer academic discussions?
Thank you. I think that's
well,
your question.
I'm a historian. I'm not a strategic advisor. You could, well, no, I would say just call that network for a moment remembrance and disagreement, and not remembrance and solidarity. That's not, I mean, I'm very much tied to the term solidarity for many reasons. But just think it as a network for remembrance and disagreement. That would tie it much better. Remembrance and solidarity is something like, oh, that's almost the same and derives the value solidarity from remembrance, one might say. Not just, this is why I quoted that sentence at the beginning, to my mind, in strategic terms, and this is an unhealing process, I would say. All what I've said is, in a way, resisting the idea that remembering via victims is a healing strategy for our national or human value systems. And we can do that. But it would also mean and include that we are producing taboos, and those taboos are exactly those where history is an unhealing process. It's the continuous questioning of all systems which make us symbiotic with a particular picture of history. And I would say understand this network and the frame of this network, and there would say the solidarity of the people who share in a way a similar aim, to use it as a forum of disagreement, critique, in order to dealing in a way the close attempt, and this is why I have some, whenever it comes to values derived from particular groups, I think yes, we are in the middle of some kind of healing, understanding, but this should be a frame where you should not strive for collective healing, but for disagreement, because only then we have a chance to understand history as it happened.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
I mean, we're not advisors to the network, and we shouldn't set ourselves up as advisors, but you did ask about what is the relationship between what the network does and what historians do. And it does seem to me that the network performs a very important function, precisely because it's aware of what is happening historiographically, what is happening in terms of the scholarship, understanding about the things that we talk about. But you also have a very important public face, so that you have inevitably a political role to play as well as a role in education. And I think that these are not exclusive roles. I don't think that the network should move in a different direction. I think what it does at the moment is very good. It does precisely that. It mobilizes the way in which people think about the past, historians think about the past. It mobilizes institutions that deal with memory and personal experience. And it has a profile which, or it has a face which looks towards politics and institutional life, and I think that's what it should be doing. It shouldn't be thinking about modifying any of those functions or becoming exclusively absorbed with historiography.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, I have one advice, probably will be, also try to be open. Yeah, try to include many voices. Yeah, even I would say, somebody mentioned here that you know, national culture is very differentiated, and they are very hot debate. Yeah, why shouldn't we know each other? You know, I would like to know more about what Hungarians are struggling or they're quarreling about. Yeah, or I know Germans probably more British. Yeah, to be representative in this sense. And I think one of the, after experience of the Soviet, of communism, I think the East Europeans share one attitude. We are probably a bit afraid about centralization, uniformization, one central committee, and one ideology. So it's and I would say the first step is actually to know each other. So as a scholar, I'm just interested in how the people think. You mentioned, for instance, this very divided memory in Italy. It's a very interesting topic, north and south of Italy, how it's, we all are limited by languages because there are so many languages in Europe, but it is very interesting as of different memory cultures. And I wouldn't, and this is my advice, I wouldn't at the beginning not exclude, yeah, also try to be inclusive, yeah, even if the people who are invited do not share your opinion, yeah. I would say all probably share generally your values, yeah, because nobody today will declare as a totalitarian mind, yeah. But to be just to hear the different as a younger generation as well. So, and once again, I would say sometimes even this is impression after this conference, because I say I am now in academic world, but also in political world. Sometimes I have an impression that the world of politics are much more open in this sense for differences than our community, scientific community, which is very sometimes very close. It's very difficult to change the paradigm. There are some, of course, scholars, Timothy Snyder, in a way, change or brought to the consciousness something which was forgotten, where actually all the crimes were committed, originally. But this would be my advice. Okay, thank you.
Yes, and a very short one. It's not an advice, just an understanding of the name of the European Network of Remembrance and Solidarity. I think we are here to show and to enjoy some solidarity toward each other's history. So the two phrases are very closely linked. And this is not a short task, and it is not a little achievement, I think, to show solidarity toward each other's memory. That's it.
We have to finish at 1:30. So we have time only for one question, unfortunately. Yes, please.
This is maybe a bit of a provocative question. You mentioned the Central Committee looking at the European Union, the European Commission, trying to create a European memory. I mean, there is a museum of European history being built just behind the European Parliament. There is an effort to also assert the European Union as a community of values. There's a big debate about the finality. Are we just a union of sovereign states? There's a referendum in Britain looming. Or is there more to the European Union? Is this an ever closer union as the constitutional treaty, which was aborted, basically formulated it? May we, or isn't there the looming danger also with Russia sort of reasserting its hegemonic role in Eastern Europe? That we might have to reflect with this finality also on the way how history is interpreted. I mean, I find this is a very interesting question. Professor Krasnodębski mentioned the fact, yeah, there are common values, but the question is what comes from these values, and there we come back to the solidarity issue. The Estonian colleague mentioned this in an earlier debate. How do we position ourselves to this? Do we draw this conclusion or this parallel with the political situation in the late 1930s when Hitler was using German minorities in order to underpin claims for territory, basically? I would be interested in your views on this.
Yes, please.
Just to give an example about the differences and how different values actually are translated into common praxis. For instance, our delegation in the European Parliament was trying to make a common resolution about Yalta agreement. And we had a not majority, you know. It's evidently everybody would say it's something what led to the division of Europe and so on. But so in many particular cases we are very different. In the political world I have to live with Podemos, Syriza, Front National and so on, and we have to respect each other because the people are elected. Yeah. In the scholarly work, this is different. But back to this common house of history. Why we are a bit, I would say, not afraid, but there is some, you know, it's a so secret project, like TTIP, like this transatlantic agreement with Americans. Yeah, we ask as a Polish MEPs, we wanted to know what will be shown that in the future, but it is not how different this different narration will be put on. So it's in a way, there is a tendency, because there is a need of common European narration, yeah? And this, I say maybe in the future, in 200 years or something like emerge, but now there is a, coming back to the social constructivism, there are attempts to construct, yeah, to construct such a common narration, and I would be so we are suspicious because, you know, it is not something which actually we enjoyed also in Europe. This variety of differences, sometimes clashes, cleavages, and so on, and what is actually our richness of culture of this continent. So yeah, this is what I wanted to say actually.
Just one or two additions to that question. I mean, I'm sure that this network cannot solve all these problems. But maybe, and I found that example from Estonia quite revealing and interesting. Maybe it's a task of this network to do something like memory watching, you know, that from the kind of genocide watch, memory watching, so and bring that together in this solidaric network to discuss what's really going on when history is going to be interpreted for political or other purposes, and to bring that into a, and that was what I was arguing for, and I understood Richard Overy's paper in a very similar approach, that this has to be put in a fully historiographical perspective, because memory is for certainties, historiography is for making knowledge uncertain. This is the starting point for historical work, I would say. And this, to bring these two elements together, this might be a good task for this forum based on some kind of memory watching.
Yeah, thank you very much. And so we have to finish the panel now. I would like to thank you for your contribution, and I would like to thank for the members of the panel, their contribution, their comments. So thank you very much.